Good evening, virtual universe. It's Zach, and thank you for watching my poetry blog. This week was, of course, the day of occupation and protest, occupying the courts, asking some basic questions about Citizens United, and I put a lot of peer pressure on you all last week to go, and then at the last minute I didn't, because I was really sick, and so I occupied my bed for most of the weekend. And it was really, really, really awesome to take days off of work and sleep and be sick and have slumber parties and have my friends over. And I felt so lucky to have a house. I felt so grateful that I was indoors and warm and had good reason to believe I was going to continue paying my rent. And I felt unbelievably grateful for that. And every time I would have to go downstairs to get whatever, I'd pass by this woman, Linda, and Linda lives on my block, and she's lived on my block for a really long time, and if she can make $39, she can have a place to sleep each night that's 3 blocks away. When I do the math, that tells me that she pays, should she get $39 every day in spare change, basically double what I pay for my room, and there's no way for her to transition out of a life where she is being gouged for the luxury of a place to sleep. And the nights that she doesn't get it, she sleeps in the alley behind our house. And she sleeps under the trees at 8th and Harrison. And she's just one of maybe 25 people who live within a block-and-a-half radius of me, because there's so many shuttered buildings and so many empty storefronts and so many tiny little alcoves that make places that are warm enough for people to sleep. And so every day I walk past people who are homeless or, marginally housed and it's unbelievable because I also walk past empty building after empty building after empty building. And statistically, we know that in San Francisco, there's 80,000 empty apartments. 80,000 empty apartments. The city agencies report that there's maybe 35,000, maybe 45,000 homeless people. Which sounds to me mathematically like we have plenty of room to move everyone into houses, and some chunk of us could shake off a roommate or two. But there's no reason for us to have to live in a housing crisis. The mayoral candidate in New York last year, whose slogan was, "The rent's too high," and they just kept saying it. And it's true. We have an entire culture of empty homes, people living too crowded because they can't afford to get a home that's bigger. We have people sleeping on the streets. We have people dying in the streets in places as nice and warm as San Francisco. We have people dying in the streets in the Castro a month ago. There's no reason that we have to accept this. This is not the scene that we need to have. And as we look at record profits being posted by Wells Fargo and their bailout money just basically padding the fortunes of this very small amount of people, it's also like, well, what if we just had no more mortgages? What if everyone just didn't have to pay anymore? They did it in Cuba, and even though I'm not some communist and I don't really think communism is this great model, in Cuba they just stopped having mortgages, and then everyone stayed in the houses they were. It took them a couple of years to sort it out, but they gave everybody houses, and they have a whole system for trading houses and moving houses. We don't need to pay our rent, we don't need to pay our mortgage, we just need places to live, and we need everyone to have them regardless of their ability to pay. You want to get the economy moving? Give everyone free rent for 2 years and find out how much money we could spend. So I'm going to read a couple things today. One is from Faggots and Their Friends Between Revolutions, as always. This is page 11. It's a book in order, and so each wisdom is progressive. The faggots cultivate beauty and harmony and peace, since these are states the men do not know anything of. The lucky faggots live in the most beautiful places, and make love in the most beautiful places, and dance in the most beautiful places. Since the men are blind to beauty, they do not know that the lucky faggots live in the most beautiful places, and the lucky faggots do not tell them. Instead, they ask the unlucky faggots to come and join them. Come and join them. Every house I've lived in since I was an adult, and in my parents' house too, we always had people coming through, people who were marginally housed, people who were transitionally housed, people who were experiencing minor bouts of houselessness. My father is a homeless rights advocate and has worked very hard to make sure that people are fed and housed, and I don't understand the culture that isn't doing it. And yes, we could demand more from our governments, and yes, we can demand more from corporations, but we can also demand more from each other. We don't need to have extra bedrooms full of clothes. We don't need to have all this empty space. Like, if you can figure out a way to share your home with people, there's really a truly long list of kids who are really looking for a place to live. we all know that San Francisco is this gay mecca, and people come here literally every day. They get off buses from whatever terrible mind state, whatever terrible actual state, and they're here to reinvent themselves, to be queer, to be happy. And they get here, and we have no resource and no mechanism for getting them jobs and getting them houses and getting them started in lives. And we know that queer people make up a giant percentage of the homeless in San Francisco. We know that queer youth are exceptionally at risk for becoming homeless even after being here for a few years. And yet we have no safety nets and we have no parachutes. And some part of that is the government, and some part of that is the corporations, and some part of that is our own selfish paradigms, and that we can all work a little bit harder to make these spaces, that we can create a food pantry without the blessing of the city. We can look into ways of getting a real space. You know, for years we've kicked around the idea of getting an urban sanctuary with dorm space or homeless shelter space. Well, it's 2012. The real estate's going to just get worse. Let's see what we can do. Let's rent a space. Let's find some way to actually start helping people have their lives be their lives, rather than a constant struggle to stay warm and be fed. So I was supposed to read from the Street Sheet, and the Street Sheet is a nonprofit that gives newspapers out to the homeless people so they can sell you something for $1, and then they can pocket the cash, and you will get something educational and awesome. And the Street Sheet writes brilliant articles and is a truly awesome organization. And every January they publish poetry, and it's poetry from homeless people all over across the country. And it's always good. It is really, really, really good. And I don't mean in some sort of like highbrow, oh, outsider art is so awesome. It's like, this is really incredible work. And I highly recommend everyone look at the January issue. And so I brought home like 5 to my house because I was going to stash them away so I could read today. And somehow managed to recycle all of them. And so I couldn't find a poem to read. And I sat around in a bar for like an hour and a half today, Googling poems about housing and poems about houselessness. And I found a lot of really sort of snobby artistic websites that featured outsider art from actual poor people. And the poor people's poems weren't that good. And the framing of the entire website was kind of offensive. And then I just started going, okay, fine. Pick a famous poet. Pick somebody that you actually like. And so I looked at Adrienne Rich, I looked at Elizabeth Bishop, and Sexton, and people that I think are really cool. And I read all their poems about homes and land ownership, and they were really amazing, but none of them fit. I couldn't find a poem today that really did it. So I decided I was sort of like psychic dick, and I would just sort of like let Google pick the poem for me, and it brought up one of my absolute least favorite poets. This is Emily Dickinson, who I sort of felt tortured by in high school. It was like, why is this the only feminist-approved woman that we get to read? We're going to read like 200 white men in poetry class or in English class, and the one person that we get to read from the entire female gender through all time is Emily Dickinson, who is just frankly not that good. But somehow, I'm going to read her poem long before I ever get around to reading some of my actual favorite poets' poems. Thanks, Google. But what's funny is this poem actually does sort of fit with how I'm feeling. And it's called I Never Felt at Home by Miss Emily Dickinson. I never felt at home below. And in the handsome skies I shall not feel at home. I know. I don't like paradise. Because it's Sunday all the time and recess never comes. And Eden will be so lonesome. Bright Wednesday afternoons. If God could make a visit or even take a nap so not to see us, but they say himself a telescope perennially beholds us. I would run away from him and the Holy Ghost and all. But then there's that judgment day. And that's still not that good a poem, but I said Emily Dickinson's not that good a poem. And I kind of like it, and I kind of hate it, and I usually am kind of repulsed by poems that are obsessed with the Christian remix and sort of going through the metaphors of Christianity as part of it, as part of like the structure of any poem. It just kind of turns me off in general, and yet somehow the turn-off for me in this poem is the lack of reverence that she has. So I'm like, oh, Eden always seems like one of the funner parts about Christianity. All right, well, as we're going to try and recreate Eden or whatever non-Christian myth, remember, we can all do something about homelessness. Thanks for watching.